understanding the causes and consequences of the war in Iran. Now, first of all, the Bible actually has quite a lot to say about Persia. Over 30 separate occasions and places Persia is mentioned. Of course, Persia was once a great empire that extended all the way to Macedonia, all the way to Libya and Egypt, and it was right up to the Indus River in India and would have encompassed what today is Pakistan. We know about Queen Esther in the Bible. She became the Queen of Persia. Esther chapter 4 verse 14 says, "For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Then Esther told him to reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So at a time of great threat to her people, Queen Esther fasted and prayed, called for more prayer, and determined to break the law, to go and see the king, although she had not been summoned, and risking her life. And she was successful, of course, and that's what the Feast of Purim celebrates to this day. Then there's the great King Cyrus, who's known as Cyrus the Great. And in the first year of Cyrus, the king of the Persians, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord which he had spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the heart of Cyrus, the king of the Persians, who commanded this to be proclaimed throughout his entire kingdom, and also in writing, saying, "Thus says Cyrus, the king of the Persians, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given to me all the kingdoms of this earth, and he has instructed me that I should build for him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judea. Who among you is from his entire people? May the Lord his God be with him, and let him ascend." And so King Cyrus of the Persians, who had just defeated Babylon, he ordered the Hebrews who were in exile to go back to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple that had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. Absolutely remarkable, extraordinary. And Cyrus the Great, therefore, became a means for restoring the temple, the very same temple that the Lord Jesus came into. And so the exiles were able to leave Babylon. Now, never before has this happened, that an exiled people had been allowed, let alone commanded, to go back. And let alone that a pagan king had ordered a temple to be built in the name of Yahweh. So an extraordinary time in history. There was a time when the Persians were the friends of Israel and where they were actually helping. So that's extraordinary. There were two major returns. You can see the green line shows under Zerubbabel, who is the first governor of Judea to return with the exiles. But then you see with the pink and red route, that of Nehemiah and Ezra, who returned. Ezra to rebuild the temple, and that was the second temple, which is this temple that the Lord Jesus came into. When the Romans saw the temple in Jerusalem, they said, "This is the greatest building in the world." There was nothing in all of Rome or Greece to compare with the magnificence of the temple. And then Nehemiah came later and sought to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And Nehemiah had a very responsible position as cupbearer to the king. That was like a personal attendant, a responsible position, much more than what we would think of as a butler. He was an advisor and a servant to the king and had access to the king. And he managed to get permission to come and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, which they did with a sword in one hand and a tool in the other. So a tool in one hand and a weapon in the other. Now, to go back in time a bit more, we know Daniel was a prophet to Persia, of course, first to Babylon. He is an exile, one of the first of the exiles sent out from Judea. And there was a time when the last king of Babylon was blasphemous enough and foolish enough to have a party, much more than a drunken party, where they were using consecrated instruments taken from the temple for their wine and drunkenness. And a hand of God came and wrote on the wall. Mene, mene, tekel, parson. Number, weight, divisions. You've been weighed in the balances and you've been found wanting. And this night, your kingdom is taken from you and it's given to the Medes and the Persians. And that was the end of the Babylonian Empire and the beginning of the Medo-Persian Empire. And Cyrus was half Median, half Persian. The Medes today are the Kurds. So the Kurds of today are the same as the Medes were in the Bible days. And Daniel served before the Babylonian king as well as the Persian king, and Darius was convinced to bring out a law: no one may pray to any god except to the king for the next 30 days. And of course, Daniel continued to pray to Yahweh, and as a result, he was thrown into the lion's den. And Daniel is the one who also wrote the prophecies of when the Messiah was to come. And therefore, when we know the stories of the wise men from the east, these were probably wise men, the Magi, probably came from what today we call Iran, what would have then been Persia, because they would have known of Daniel's prophecies, and Daniel gave the exact date. So when they were guided by the stars, there might have been an actual star they were following, but it might have meant more that they were studying the times and the seasons to work out the dating as to when Messiah would come. And they, of course, went and were led all the way to Bethlehem. So there's a Persian link throughout the Bible. And in many ways, Persia's been a blessing to God's people. Now, there is a prophecy in Jeremiah 49 about Elam. Now, Elam is part of Persia, part of what today is Iran. In fact, Susa, which was once the capital of Persia, is right in the heart of the Elamites' land. Thus says the Lord of hosts, behold, I will break the bow of Elam, the foremost of their might. Against Elam I will bring the four winds and the four quarters of heaven, and scatter them towards all those winds. There shall be no nations where the outcasts of Elam will not go. In fact, there are Iranians living all over the world and dispersed at this time. For I will cause Elam to be dismayed before their enemies, and before those who seek their life. I will bring disaster upon them. My fierce anger, says the Lord, and I will send the sword after them until I've consumed them. I will set my throne in Elam, and will destroy from there the king and the princes, says the Lord. But it shall come to pass in the latter days, I will bring back the captives of Elam, says the Lord. So what can we make of that? Certainly there's going to be great devastation and judgment, but there's also going to be a return to the land of Elam or of Persia. Now, right now, we've got a war between Israel and Iran that has also sucked America in. Now, Israel's been under a lot of attack from its beginning, and they have been used to getting a hail of stones thrown at them, and now missiles too. Now, the Ayatollah, who's the successor to the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was just assassinated in the first strike of the Americans and of the Israelis. The Israelis call it Lion's Roar, and the Americans are calling their operation Epic Fury. Well, thousands of targets were struck in Iran on the first night. I think Saturday last week was the beginning of this war, and they poured down vast amounts of destruction upon them. I should say Saturday the previous week. And Iran had about 2,000 targets struck in the first wave of attacks. Vast amounts of Tomahawk missiles and airstrikes coming in. And Iran, of course, struck back. And Iran's got the biggest ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. Absolutely phenomenal, vast amounts. Some of them even hypersonic missiles like the Fatah. And that can go 1,400 kilometers, but can travel at 18,000 kilometers an hour. You can't intercept a hypersonic missile. So they are very much, I'm sure, giving nightmares to captains of the US aircraft carriers and so on. Hypersonic missiles, I don't know that anyone's worked out a counter to just yet. So you get missiles being sent in, and then counter missiles, the so-called Iron Dome, working on reacting. Now, at one stage, the counter missiles cost much more than the missiles. But apparently they work out improvements on it too. But the destruction, you can barely imagine the destruction to living quarters, homes in the middle of cities, suddenly getting missiles flying in, and this is going on both sides. Although we've learned that the Israeli government's not allowing the film crews to film any of the counter-strikes or the damage being done by the missiles. That could be for good reason, that the enemy would be able to work out where they're missing or how short they are, or being able to see where the counter-missiles are coming from. So at any rate, there's a limited amount of knowledge. We don't know how much damage is being done in the state of Israel right now, because there's obviously careful control of what information is coming out. During wars, it's traditional for governments to underestimate their own losses and to overestimate the enemy's losses. And you can see that with the Ukraine war. But we've got friends in the Middle East reporting back saying we're running to the air raid shelters multiple times a day. And the sirens are going off almost constantly. So that's got to be horrific. My mother grew up under the 1,000 bomber raids in Berlin, and she spent many a night in the bomb shelters and came out the next morning to find the suburb burning and seeing ruin and wreckage all around, which is very shocking for any young girl. My mom was just 6 years old when she experienced the first aerial bombardments and was almost trampled to death at the circus where she was at that time by the stampede of animals and people. But to grow up amongst this sort of thing must be horrific. I don't think we've seen devastation quite like this, what must be going on in the Middle East. And I think all the statistics of the death tolls and the casualties must be understated, because it doesn't make sense that you can have that many thousands of missiles going around, and then Israel claims they've had 10 casualties, and according to Iran, they've had 1,000 casualties. Well, with the amount of ordnance blowing up all around in dense residential areas, it's hard to believe that the death toll is not much higher. And Iran is a sophisticated country. They've got some very advanced missiles. They have got a wide range of missiles, and they take great pride in their missile collection. And yes, Iran's been shipping a lot of missiles, and yet America's been striking every target they can. So Iran anticipated this. They've been preparing for it. They've apparently spread their missile collection out around the country, and they've got a lot more to go, they say. But we've noticed that the number of missiles being launched from Iran have been going down steadily over the last week. And so this is a war primarily of missiles right now. Sometimes aircraft might see one another, but seldom is there anything to do with ground forces. This is a war of the air, and it's a war of ballistic missiles so far, and counter missiles. But the destruction has got to be absolutely horrific, and you can only pray for the people caught up in the middle of this. Now, according to, on about the fifth day, the Americans were saying they had struck 3,000 targets in Iran, hit 43 Iranian ships, and that there was an 83% drop in Iranian drone attacks since day one, a 90% drop in Iranian ballistic missiles. 12 countries surrounding Iran had been hit by Iranian missiles. But what you should be considering is the Christians in Iran. There are hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of Christians in Iran. Hard to tell because they are an underground church, a secret church. Of course, they must be very careful. Christians get arrested, Christians get flogged, Christians have been killed in Iran. It is a dangerous thing, especially if you're a Christian who comes from a Muslim background, what we call a Muslim background believer. They are targeted. Officially, according to a statistic, 1.5% of Iran are Christians, but that's a statistic from 5 years ago. Apparently, there's been so many more Muslims coming to Christ in Iran that it could be 3 million or more Christians in Iran at this time. So pray for the church in Iran. Some of these churches have been there for a long time, dating back over a millennium, the Assyrian Christians, for example. But there's a lot of new Christians from Iranian background, from Muslim background as well. And we need to be remembering the Christians are caught up in the crossfire. They are literally in the middle of this. And the number of Christians being arrested in Iran has been increasing. Somebody posted, if your religion promotes the killing of non-believers, the beating of women, punishing rape victims, or selling your daughters as wives at age 12, you're not praying to God above, you're praying to the one below. And that's a good point. Believe it or not, this is a picture of Iran back in 1970s. Before Islam, or rather radical Sharia law, took over under the Ayatollah in 1979, people in Iran were much more rejoicing, dancing, but not now. Women are being waged war against in Iran. From the very beginning, the Ayatollah Khomeini basically declared war on women. And to see women being kicked in the streets is not unusual. The Ayatollah Khomeini banned women from singing. Women are not allowed to sing. Women who've posted videos of themselves on social media singing have been flogged, sometimes 74 lashes. And Ayatollah Khomeini said, women's voices are sensual, and therefore they might lead to some men having immoral thoughts. Therefore, the women should be flogged if they sing. No woman's allowed to sing in public. Now, it might be news to some people, but they don't sing in mosques. Christianity is unique in being a singing religion. You don't get people singing in other religions, and certainly not in Islam, but women are not allowed to sing anyway in Iran. And in all women judges, there were hundreds of female judges in the Shah's Iran. They were all kicked out of the judiciary when Ayatollah Khomeini came in. And from day one, he required all women in state service to wear the hijab. Not a strand of hair is to be visible. One strand of hair visible, you can be flogged. They've got what they call the morality police. These religious police patrol the streets relentlessly to find a woman who's got a strand of hair visible, and they can be warned or flogged or arrested. Did you know that letting your hair blow in the wind is a crime in Iran? Literally. Now, a legend in Iran is Masha Amini. She protested about the hijab. She got arrested. She got beaten to death. Iranian women have continued to be defiant despite being flogged, what they call medieval flogging, for violating hijab rules, how you're meant to wear the hijab. If you push your hijab back a bit so that some of your hair is visible, that's enough to get you arrested and flogged. These are pictures of women who've been hung in Iran for different offenses. Now, the offenses could be like the woman in the top right-hand corner. She is being hung for being a victim of rape. That's correct, a victim. In Iran, under Sharia law, they teach that a woman is 90% to blame for a rape because she has the power of enticement. Therefore, in a rape, the woman gets executed. The man might get a slap on the wrist, unlikely, but not much more than that. And so the rapist goes free, the victim gets killed. That is Sharia law according to Ayatollah. And they hung a lot of women, they hang a lot of men too. There's a long list of women who've been executed under the Ayatollah. So the Ayatollah who just got assassinated, nobody needs to weep for him. He had a lot of victims. By the way, one of the things Ayatollah did when he came into power in 1979 is he lowered the age of consent for marriage down to age 9. By the way, these are all women who've been killed in Iran, just some of them, with their faces visible, which is no doubt a crime in Iran. Now, you may be surprised to know that the prostitution industry is alive and well in Iran. Now, with the morality police arresting people for hugging their husband in public or holding hands with their husband, if you can be arrested and flogged for that, you would have thought prostitution is illegal. Not actually, because under Sharia law, you can have a temporary marriage. Now, temporary marriages can be for a month, it can be for a week, it could be for a few days, it could be for an hour. There have even been temporary marriages for 30 minutes. And there's no requirement of responsibility, no need for support, and if any child's born, there's no obligation on the man's side. Temporary marriages are without any long-term commitment or responsibility. So what they do is, sometimes it's the Uber drivers are acting as go-betweens to bring interested people, which could include some of the ayatollahs, by the way, and the sheikhs and the imams, because apparently they're all involved in this. And so the sex industry, the prostitution industry in Iran is operated under the loophole of temporary marriages, which Islam allows. And they say these are normally divorcees, because a divorcee's got no support, there's no rights for a woman in Islamic law countries like Iran. And this means that for survival, many divorcees are out there needing to, or choosing to, engage in these so-called temporary marriages, which is nothing other than prostitution. And of course, alcohol is illegal in Iran. That doesn't mean there's not a big underground business. Vast amounts of alcohol is smuggled in and used. I had an Australian friend who said that he lived like a king traveling through Iran by smuggling bottles of brandy and so on, and he could sell it for vast amounts, and he would be able to afford staying in the most expensive hotels because the demand for illegal liquor is so high. They've also got a massive problem with drugs. Huge amount of the young people in Iran are drug addicts, and a lot of the drugs come from Afghanistan, which USAID was funding, so that even Taliban growers of opium were getting funded by USAID before Doge put an end to that nonsense, so that they would even have sprinkler systems, irrigation systems paid for by US taxpayers for their opium plants. And Afghanistan's right next door to Iran, so they get in, and the people in Iran are turning to drugs and drink out of absolute desperation. What few Westerners understand is Muslim leaders who call for the overthrow of all governments on earth and the establishment of an Islamic superstate controlling all aspects of life for every person on earth, they're not necessarily extremists on the fringe of Islam. Jihad, the subjugation, the forcible conversion of all people to Islam, and world domination are in fact central pillars of Islam. Jihad is the sixth pillar of Islam. And Muhammad even called it the second most important commandment indeed. Jihad was so important to Muhammad, he declared it to be the second most important deed in Islam. Allah's apostle was asked, what is the best deed? He replied, to believe in Allah and in his apostle. The questioner then asked, what is the next in goodness? And Muhammad replied, to participate in jihad, in Allah's cause. And that's in the hadith. Now, interesting how many liberals in the West are protesting and demonstrating for Iran right now, or the Iran regime. Because if they would travel to Iran, they'd probably be hung. Gays in Iran, LGBTQ, are regularly hung, sometimes from cranes or from scaffoldings. And these are just some of the pictures of people who've been hung in Iran. There's just one memorial set up. Free Iran, stop executions in Iran. Since the Ayatollah took over in 1979, thousands, tens of thousands of people have been hung. They started off with the generals in charge of the army and the police, and then they worked their way through all sorts of people, and then they started hanging vast amounts of women and gays and so on. So Iran has the most executions of any country in the world, percentage to its population. So notice the cultural differences. Getting stoned in Iran versus getting stoned in the West. Taking shots in Afghanistan versus taking shots in Iran. Gay guys hanging out in Iran versus gay guys hanging out in the West. So the terms we use can mean something very different. But then the pedophilia is probably the worst. Because Muhammad had Aisha, a 6-year-old, as a bride, which, according to Hadith, he consummated the marriage at age 9. Under Sharia law, marriage can be down to age 9. And the Ayatollah, one of the first things he did was lower the age of consent for marriage to 9 years old. And so child brides, people selling their daughters to marry someone who might be 6 times their age. This is not child marriage. This is statutory rape in any civilized country. The state of the world in one picture. In the West, we've got our eyes blindfolded. In the East, they've got everything else covered. So, the state of the world. If you want an insight into what it's like in Iran, you need to read the book or watch the film, Not Without My Daughter, by Betty Mahmoudi. A real insight. This is an American woman from a Christian background who married a Muslim doctor, medical doctor, who then wanted to visit his family in Iran. And when he got there, he decided to stay. And he went from being a nice husband and father to being an abusive, physically abusive man, beating his wife, hitting her in the face. And if she tried to flee, she couldn't take her daughter because according to Sharia law, the man has possession, custody of the children. And the woman has no rights, really. So she determined, I'm not going to leave Iran without my daughter, hence the title. And the whole book and the whole film is about how she conspired and worked and planned to flee Iran with her daughter. And there's a lot that we need to understand about Iran, but you can't understand it and a tragedy without understanding what it was like before under the Shah. Now, the Shah of Iran did a lot of modernization, and during his time, he, for the first time, gave a high place of honor and position responsibility to the Queen, and there were a lot of improvements of women's rights. Under the Shah of Iran, the hijab and face veils were banned, and there was a lot of work done to raise women's rights and get women involved in every area, including in the judiciary. Under the Shah, they celebrate 2,500 years of Iran. It's phenomenal. There can't be many countries that have that long a history, and nobody would have thought it possible that this great civilization could come to an end in just a few years. And so the Shah was a great modernizer. He built a much more modern state. He basically brought Iran into the 20th century and brought in a lot of liberalization so that there could be real freedoms for all people in the country. And you can see how even Time magazine acknowledged the Shah in a very unstable part of the world, in the Middle East. He brought an island of stability, and he brought modernization and did a lot of good for the people of Iran. And this is documented by books like The Economic Modernization of Iran from 1953 to 1968, which is a tremendous achievement. And you can even see some of the advances in just look at the architecture of Tehran, the capital. And the Shah of Iran, by the way, was a good friend of South Africa. When the world was sanctioning South Africa, he sold Iranian oil to us in South Africa at much below the market price, which is a reason why the ANC hated the Shah and loves the Ayatollahs. But Jimmy Carter's foreign policy was absolutely disastrous for the persecuted church. I document this in my Gospel Defense League. Jimmy Carter's foreign policy was disastrous for the persecuted church, which is on our table above the stairs. And you can see everything I've got in quote marks here. I'm quoting from the authorities. The Shah of Iran testified of the treachery of Jimmy Carter's State Department. President Reagan repeatedly stated America's so-called misguided policies in Iran caused the fall of the late Shah and called it an historic stain in American history. And despite the Shah's 37 years alliance with the United States in the Middle East, America's best ally and most stabilizing influence in the Middle East during a difficult time in history, Jimmy Carter effectively undermined him. And that's quoting from George Bush. And then General Haig was sent to Iran to incapacitate the military, to warn the military under no circumstances fire on these violent protesters. And he basically crippled the Iranian military, as documented. Carter himself admitted to following the duplicitous advice of the American ambassador Sullivan, who was a sympathizer of the pro-Mossadegh forces, and Carter's memoirs even admit he shouldn't have listened to his ambassador. His ambassador was lying to him. American officials later condemned Carter's policies as deceitful and Sullivan's views as dangerously misguided. I think they're being too kind. It was probably not misguided, it was probably just malicious. Years later, Brzezinski acknowledged that the political uprising against the Shah had American backing. So he was America's Secretary of State, and he's admitting, we were backing the uprising. And this ultimately led to his removal from power. Even Henry Kissinger in The Economist admits to that. This policy miscalculation not only caused the Shah's downfall, but also plunged Iran into chaos, leaving it a victim of history. Quoting from the very same General Alexander Haig, who was a key part of ensuring that the Shah's forces were prevented from defending the country against these revolutionary violent terrorists in the street. Carter's State Department displayed overt hostility towards the Shah, says Brzezinski. The Shah soon realized neither Carter nor the American government had any intention of supporting him. He described Carter's policy as delusional, and the Carter administration repeatedly instructed its ambassador to warn the Shah about human rights issues. Jimmy Carter was obsessed with human rights issues, and Ronald Reagan pointed this out. He said, Jimmy Carter continually expressed concern about the human rights abuses of pro-Western countries who were defending themselves against Soviet communist terrorism. But he had no concerns about the worst human rights abuses in the world taking place in the Soviet Union, and he was sending vast amount of American grain and aid technology to the Soviet Union, who was the greatest threat to peace and human rights in the world. History has since recorded Carter's administration as confused, hypocritical, and paralyzed in the face of Iran's escalating crisis. And at the height of the turmoil, the Shah was abandoned, quoting again from Nixon in his book on leaders. Carter lacked a true understanding of the crisis and its catastrophic consequences. He failed to make sound decisions, all that quoting from President Nixon. He did not grasp the irreversible damage his policies caused, and that's according to his Secretary of State Brzezinski. Sullivan advised Carter to demand the Shah to leave Iran immediately and to align with Khomeini, and Sullivan was the American ambassador to Iran. I mean, Jimmy Carter must be one of the stupidest or one of the most evil presidents to have ever inhabited the United States. Meanwhile, American intelligence agencies were, to quote from the French Interior Minister, disorganized, ignoring one another's warnings. Most notably, the CIA failed to predict the 1979 uprising or upheaval, which the people living there could predict, but somehow or another the CIA didn't seem to see it coming like everyone else did. And the disastrous rise of the mullahs in Iran. And they cemented Carter's role as a key figure in the fiasco. Carter's policies were, quote, unrealistic, clumsy, short-sighted, indecisive, full of contradictions, causing global repercussions. His treatment of the Shah during his illness was inhumane. The Shah was suffering from cancer from 1974. Although virtually nobody knew about it, he kept it a secret. He was that kind of person. It was Carter who, among world leaders, quickly deemed Khomeini a sacred figure. I mean, one of the most bloodthirsty mass murderers who hung women by the thousands and allowed child abuse down to age 9. And he's a sacred figure. He described him as a religious and moderate leader. I mean, how delusional and stupid can you be? Well, Hillary Clinton called the Muslim Brotherhood a force for peace and moderation. And here's Carter calling the Ayatollah Khomeini, the godfather of terrorism, as a moderate leader. The ties between Khomeini and Carter before 1979 became clear to all, even the BBC could see that. And the Ayatollah Khomeini became one of the most evil forces in the latter part of the 20th century. What he did to the paradise of Iran is unforgivable. The Iranian Tosh newspaper later published an interview with the French President Giscard d'Estaing, who said the United States rang the death knell for the Shah's rule because Carter had no hope for the regime's survival. Sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's no hope, so we don't help them, so we help his enemies. And then said, you see, we said there's no hope. Well, it was the result of American interference. They betrayed Iran into the hands of the Ayatollah Khomeini. You could say that Donald Trump is trying to clean up the mess made by Jimmy Carter. When Khomeini orchestrated the hostage crisis, Carter first wrote a pleading letter, then he resorted to prayer. He later sent a rescue mission, which ended in disastrous failure. You might recall that the American rescue plan was a classic example of minimum force. And when there was too much sand and a crash in the desert, suddenly minimum force became inadequate force, and they had to abandon the whole thing and flee. leaving 8 dead Americans behind. And so while the German Grenzschutztruppe 9 successfully rescued all their hostages in Somalia in 1976, brought them all home safe. And while the Israelis rescued their hostages in Entebbe in Uganda in 1976, but the Americans failed to rescue their hostages in Iran in 1980. Respect for America under Jimmy Carter plummeted to unprecedented depths. There's nothing the Muslims respect more than strength. There's nothing they despise more than weakness. And the Shah foresaw the devastating catastrophe that was unfolding. The best way to build tyranny and dictatorship is on the ruins of freedom. And Jimmy Carter, wielding his political and intelligence apparatus, deliberately supported the so-called opposition forces to pressure the Shah and lied to him about just leave the country temporarily for everything to calm down, then you can return, knowing that when he left, he would never be able to return. The CIA director later confirmed the Shah's concerns. Had we shown more vigilance, this is the head of the CIA admitting, America's policy during Iran's turmoil could have been very different. No jokes. Carter's presidency was marked by indecision and weakness. His administration was a series of contradictions, errors, and incompetence, leading to global distrust in both his government and US foreign policy. People need to remember, and Americans need to be reminded, they wouldn't be fighting a war in Iran today if Jimmy Carter hadn't been so cursedly treacherous to an American ally back in 1979. And it wasn't just that the Ayatollah was being brought to power in Iran by Jimmy Carter's administration. Jimmy Carter's administration was at that moment betraying Rhodesia into the hands of Mugabe's ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe. And so Iran is Jimmy Carter's foreign policy legacy, as is Zimbabwe. And I was sitting in the early 1980s in Ajamba in Angola, and Jonas Savimbi, the UNITA freedom fighter, said, "It's better to be America's enemy than America's friend. If you're America's enemy, you will probably be bought. But if you're America's friend, you will certainly be sold." And he also said, do you know why there hasn't been a revolution in America for 200 years? And I was there with a whole lot of American guests I brought in to meet Jonas Savimbi, and everyone sits in confusion and shaking their heads. And Jonas Savimbi said, there's no American embassy in America. And all the Angolans were bursting into laughter, and the Americans looked at one another like, what's a joke? But the Africans know revolutions in our countries normally start at the cursed American embassy. They have been a cause of such subversion. Do you know the US Embassy in South Africa had a reading room in Soweto, 1976, where the books were not, and they weren't just books, there were videos and comics as well, but they weren't about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. No, they were on Mao Zedong, Fidel Castro, Vladimir Lenin, Karl Marx. It was all communist, Marxist, revolutionary garbage. And there's a reading room in Soweto. The Americans lit the fuse that erupted into the 16 June 1976 riots, which had people being cooked and eaten on the sidewalks and shocking violence taking place all over the country, which is what we celebrate on the 16th of June. Obama and Biden followed Jimmy Carter's disastrous doctrine in the Middle East. American authors frequently criticized Carter's populist, controversial behavior. While Carter is now gone, his policy live on what can be described as Carter 2, Obama, and Carter 3, Biden. Regarding the Islamic Republic, perhaps his death will mark the end of these misguided policies and their dark legacy. Yet the world first faced the rise of Islamic radicalism during Carter's era, and the failed battle against terrorism continues to this day. So Jimmy Carter authored Our Endangered Values, in which he criticized President George Bush's disastrous wars in the Middle East. Fair enough. But they were actually following the Carter Doctrine, which he established regarding the Persian Gulf as a vital US interest, requiring military intervention to maintain the status quo. So the reason why America got tied into wars in the Persian Gulf area is Jimmy Carter's policy. US foreign policy affects believers in Africa and the Middle East. And some eulogies of Jimmy Carter claimed even small acts can change the world. And Jimmy Carter's actions touched many lives. And of course, that's true. But in Jimmy Carter's case, that is disastrously so. His intentions may have been good. I don't believe so, but let's just grant that maybe his intentions were good. But the consequences have certainly been consistently catastrophic. It was Jimmy Carter's government meddling in Afghanistan early in 1979 that provoked the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan in Christmas of that year. So America's disastrous involvement in Afghanistan since then became increasingly counterproductive and disastrous, especially for the local population. First of all, the Soviets would not have invaded Afghanistan if Iran had been under control of the Shah. Iran had a phenomenally big military, and they were positioned to prevent the Soviets moving south. They were protecting that flank. And Iran would have intervened and made it a very miserable failure if the Soviets had attempted to come into Afghanistan when he was Shah. By the way, just look at all the media there. It doesn't look like this is a surprise to anyone. And this, by the way, to make it really ironic, this is called the Friendship Bridge. The Russians built this bridge for for trade between Afghanistan and Russia, and the Friendship Bridge was the bridge over which the invasion forces came. And so, how many hundreds of thousands of people were killed? How many millions suffered in Afghanistan because of Jimmy Carter's meddling and his removing the one person who could have prevented the invasion of Afghanistan? By the way, the Soviets had a disgusting tool of terror in Afghanistan called the butterfly bomb. It's a little plastic explosive device that is like a butterfly. And they threw it out of the planes and helicopters, and it would fall to the ground. And if I stepped in it with one of my boots, nothing would happen. But if I was barefoot, as most Afghans were, and I stepped in it, the chemicals in there would explode. And of course, because it's a plastic cover, you get plastic shrapnel, which X-rays can't detect. So the doctors would be forced to amputate the whole leg because this kid stepped on this butterfly bomb, which is only about 35 grams, not big at all. And actually, if it went off and I was wearing boots, it probably wouldn't cause any harm. But for bare feet people, basically meant they lost their limb. And some criminal in the Kremlin worked out this, that it's better to cripple people in Afghanistan than to kill them, because you kill them, they're able to stay and fight. But if you cripple somebody, the family's going to move them out the country to Pakistan where they can get some medical care, and then you've lost even more people. So better to cripple a bigger burden than to kill. And that's the butterfly bomb. The amount of sick, sordid, twisted tactics used in Afghanistan just showed what we were fighting with in the Soviet Union. But Carter's only response was to boycott the Olympics, which is about as worthless an action as possible. Why should the sportsmen be affected? Why can't you deal with this in a political or military way? But no, he just ruined the 1980 Olympics. That's about all Jimmy Carter could do. Now, the ANC loves the Ayatollahs. Forget about all this, end of gender violence and women's rights, which Mandela said was to be the pillar of his foreign policy, human rights and women's rights. This is the biggest enemy of women's rights on the planet. And I don't know if you can hear this, but when Nelson Mandela met the Ayatollah, it was my leader. Well, Ian Smith testifies to the betrayal of Jimmy Carter that treacherously betrayed their previous allies, the Rhodesians, and the Shah gives an even more eloquent testimony of the treachery of Jimmy Carter against the Iranian people. Professor Anthony Sutton documents the best enemy money can buy, showing how the US economy and companies have funded, have given technology transfers, have supplied the weapons for Red China and for the Soviet Union. And I've documented what I've just gone through in our Gospel Defense League on Jimmy Carter's foreign policy. The best enemy money can buy. It's in our library. I must say, sickening to think that they use the arsenal of democracy to fund the worst tyrannies on earth. And in the name of freedom, but Islamic militants in London say, freedom, go to hell. which is pretty eloquent. Death to all Jews. Now, I think that these people need to test me in phonics, because I don't think he's against fruit juice. But that gives you an idea of the mentality. So Israel identified Iran as its biggest enemy in the Middle East, as the only power that could really oppose them. And the military in Iran didn't attempt to face Israel directly either, because they knew they've got America as an ally. But they set up a whole terrorist network. And so Iran has become one of the biggest sponsors of terrorism worldwide. Well, as you can see, most seem to have been eliminated in the first week of this war. But Hamas and Hezbollah, these are terrorist proxies run by Iran, as are the Houthis. And so Iran has been funding the terrorists, but who's been funding Iran? Do you remember back when Barack Hussein Obama was president of America, and he apparently made a secret deal with Iran? The first news was $400 million, but it later was increased as they dug deeper. $1.7 billion was sent to Iran on pallets, cash. They literally put pallets of $100 bills on pallets and put them on plane and flew those into Iran. And Iran used that money to fund Hezbollah and Hamas and the other terrorists. The biggest funders of terrorism in the world were funded by the US government, by the orders of the US president itself under Barack Hussein Obama. So here's some of the cartoons. Death to America, Iranian torpedo boats. It's Iranian Navy, sir. Fire cash pallet number 1. And I mean, this is not a ransom. We're just reimbursing Iran for the hostages room and board. Remember that the American embassy were held for 444 days of terror, mock executions, blindfolded, abused horribly, kicked, and all the rest of it. And this is not really a joke. We sent a plane full of cash to Iran, then lied about it, and my sheep still think I'm a great president, and he's still got a second term in office. So you could say the Ayatollah and Obama were partners in crime. I sent pallets of cash to my terrorist friend, and Trump goes and kills him. I mean, evil Trump. And Tehran does have tentacles. I've got no sympathy for the Tehran government. I'm not into interfering in other people's countries, like what Carter did with the Shah's Iran. But notice there's what they call a Shia crescent. The King of Jordan points out that there's a crescent-shaped area of Sharia law and the Shiite Muslims, and that goes through Syria, Lebanon, and parts of northern Iraq, and of course even down to Qatar. Qatar is heavily Shiite as well. And so there's terrorists all over the Middle East who've been funded by Iran, who were given the cash by Barack Hussein Obama. And then there's a whole lot of other homes for terrorism. We've got the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram. Instability all over the world, going all the way down to Mozambique, where we've got ISIS affiliates. And these people are funded by Iran. There's over 40 militant groups who've pledged allegiance to ISIS, which is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And in Somalia, it's is Al-Shabaab, who attack Kenya regularly. And churches are destroyed in the wake of these attacks. Even the BBC recognizes what these creeps have been doing, but funded by Iran, and Iran funded by Obama. And now America has been concerned about the nuclear capabilities of Iran. Interestingly, Russia Today made an article recently on when Africa had nuclear weapons. And they pointed out that South Africa was the one African nation which had nuclear weapons. And we, of course, dismantled it. We're the only nuclear-powered nation that voluntarily gave up our nuclear weapons. And look where it got us. We developed nuclear weapons in the 70s as a final resort to prevent any invasion or being overwhelmed by our neighboring states. And I know the Southern government spoke of, we can drop a nuke on Harare, we can drop a nuke on Lusaka if needed, leave us alone. And I've seen Pelindaba, which is our main nuclear research facility. South Africa developed sophisticated nuclear weapons program. And these are some of the casings of nuclear bombs that we had at Pelindaba. I'm not sure I think all the plans were destroyed, all the resources were destroyed, but maybe we still had some uranium, because we've certainly supplied uranium to Iran. I'm talking about the ANC government of South Africa. So if you look at Iran's military capability next to that of Israel, you can see Iran has advantages of Israel. Israel's got much more money, but funding thanks to US and German subsidies, but Iran's got far more people and far more people that they can call on. And yes, they've got about the same amount of aircraft and helicopters. Iran certainly has a lot more armored vehicles than Israel, and they've got more submarines. But you can see that the firepower's pretty much even, and Israel could not easily defeat Iran, probably not at all. And yes, Iran's got more people and Iran's got a lot of different weapons, but Israel has unlimited amount of funding. So the strategic capabilities are basically that Israel recognized they could not take out Iran on their own. Iran has a phenomenal amount of military hardware, a lot of which they got from Red China, some they got from Russia, and some of it would have dated back from when America was supporting the Shah. But the military capabilities are not just of Iran, but you've got to consider other countries. Now, one of our missionaries who was with us back in the early 80s, Martha McComb, she's now in Jordan, working with Youth of the Mission. And I got a letter from her today, and she's saying, we're regularly under fire in Jordan. The sirens go off every day, and they've got to rush to the bomb shelters. What's Jordan getting bombed for? But even Jordan's being bombed. Iran has bombed 12 different countries in the Middle East. Now, that's why Israel's done everything they can to bring America in on this war on their side, because America's got billions more in budget. And by the way, this must be out of date, because I believe their budget for this year was over $1 trillion. America doesn't have that many troops right now. It's more closer to about 1 million, and apparently Iran's got about 1 million as well. Of course, America's got vastly more aircraft, vastly more tanks, vastly more armored carriers, and also America's got a vast amount of nuclear weapons, and we know Iran has none. And if they ever wanted to have any, which we're not sure about, but they certainly don't have any now. And America's got a monopoly of aircraft carriers, 24 aircraft carriers, 68 submarines. So the firepower on the American side is very disproportionately greater. Iran cannot beat America. I don't know if America can beat Iran, because it's one thing to be able to bomb them, but if they ever send in ground troops, Iran is a vast area. Iran is as big as Western Europe. It's a huge area, and it's a very inhospitable territory. Interesting, when you look at what's the best tank on the Iran side, it's the old T-72. Now, I remember the old T-72s. We shot up a few of them in Angola. The T-72 is great for Europe. Low profile, sort of sneak up over a hillside and be able to have your gun depressed quite a lot to be able to fire using best use of cover. In Angola, they were useless because there's elephant grass in Angola. And so the T-72s were always not able to see through the elephant grass. And that meant the commander had to put his head out of the turret, nice target for any sniper. And of course, that could ruin the whole chance of anything. So the T-72 might be good for Europe, but it's pretty useless for Africa. I don't know how good it is for Iran. The American M1 Auburn is probably far superior. And there's no doubt America overwhelmingly can destroy a lot in Iran. Iran, however, has survived a lot of invading armies over the years. Iran has kept its identity over the years. They never succumbed to Arabic, even when they were invaded by the Arabs and defeated. The capital's been conquered by the Greeks and others over the years, but yet Iran or Persia has continued to survive over the centuries. It's a very resilient empire. And so comparing the military arsenal of America to that of Iran, you can see America is overwhelmingly great in every category which you can imagine. But of course, the Iranians could have sleeper cells of terrorists all over America, and Britain, and France, and all of Europe for that matter. Now, interestingly, this pathetic excuse for a human being, Keir Starmer, which must be one of the worst prime ministers Britain's ever had, he would not allow the Americans to use their air bases in the British Isles for operations, not even for resupply. Worse than that, he forbade the United States from using the Diego Garcia site, the military base in the middle of the Indian Ocean, which is one of the bribes that Winston Churchill gave to Franklin Delano Roosevelt to get American aid in the Second World War. Diego Garcia is a very isolated but strategically placed island, which was packed with B-2 bombers and so on. But Britain wouldn't allow America to use that island, which Britain basically gave to America. But it's still theoretically under British control. And so America's just moved the aircraft carriers in, and when the Americans started to win the war, Starmer said, oh, we'll send our 2 aircraft carriers to the Middle East, and President Trump said, we don't need them anymore. But we'll remember that you didn't help us when we needed you, which is the beginning of the war. And if you've seen these aircraft carriers, they are overwhelming, phenomenal. When the President Theodore Roosevelt came to Cape Town, it couldn't fit in the harbor. It had to sit out in Table Bay, and it almost filled Table Bay. It was huge. More personnel on one American aircraft carrier than we have in our entire Navy. More aircraft on that aircraft carrier than we have in the whole South African Air Force. It's a really powerful means of projecting power and influence into another area, a strike force, a platform for launching vast amounts of aircraft and the huge amounts of weaponry they've got on these aircraft carriers. And of course, they're nuclear-powered aircraft carriers that can stay at sea for ages. They're surrounded by support ships, all kinds of impressive destroyers, cruisers, and so on, guided missile carriers. In all of history, I think the Americans have only lost 3 aircraft carriers sunk in battle. And that was 4 of them, actually. And that was back in 1942, not a good year for aircraft carriers. And America lost at Coral Sea and at the Battle of Midway, and then also towards the end of 1942 in combat against the Japanese. But a carrier strike group has a tremendous array of weapons and Marines on board. Now, on the left, you can see the aircraft carriers in the Second World War. Japan had 13 aircraft carriers, Britain had 9 aircraft carriers, America had 8, France had 1, Germany had none, which is interesting because Germany was accused of world domination. Well, you can't dominate the world without aircraft carriers, and Germany didn't even have a plane design that could land on an aircraft carrier. And even when they defeated France, they didn't take France's battleships or aircraft carriers, which they would have needed for world domination. So obviously that was propaganda. Today there are 28 aircraft carriers in the world, of which 24 are American. This is a little out of date because India now has 2 aircraft carriers, and Britain now has 2 aircraft carriers as well. So this is slightly out of date. But you'll see Iran has none. And so with the amount of weaponry going into the region, they don't really need Britain's 2 aircraft carriers. They don't need France's late offer either. Now, just to go back to the Battle of Midway, which is the biggest aircraft carrier battle in history, which you might have seen films on, it was a battle where the opposing fleets never saw one another. And the Americans had the advantage of they had cracked the Japanese Purple Code. They were reading the naval traffic in real time. They knew the exact dispositions, plans, and movements of the Japanese enemy, just like the British had cracked the German Enigma Code and were reading everything of the plans and deployments and order of battle of their opponents. Now, the Japanese had combat air patrols that have Zeros orbiting to protect their carriers from attack. And so what the Americans did was they launched their different torpedo planes and their squadrons of dive bombers in stages. And so the first few squadrons that came over the aircraft carriers were shot down. Basically, they lost everything and everyone, every plane shot down. But in doing it that way, all the combat air patrol were down to sea level. And so when the final dive bomber squadron came, the Japanese fleet was left without any combat air patrol because they had all been expended in defending the aircraft carriers against the waves of attacks. And this is something that one has to consider when it comes to these battles, because America's got aircraft carriers in the Gulf, and yes, they've got a phenomenal array of anti-aircraft weaponry and intercepted ballistic missiles. But, you know, like what you learned in the Battle of Midway, you can wear out the defenses. So either they run out of their countermeasures, or you just find them at a point where if you throw too much at one time, not all the shields and countermeasures can come to play. You can overwhelm the defenses. And so that's a possibility. Maybe you've seen the film, The Battle of Midway. I remember seeing that film. It was the first surround sound, I think, that ever came out. And you got into the cinema and they had the speakers all around. You could actually hear when the engines of the plane started and the explosions. It was like it was all around you. It was quite an experience, the surround sound. Battle of Midway film was propaganda, good propaganda, I mean, interesting propaganda, but still. They had an imbecilic romantic story in the middle of it, but if you could just get past that, the film was pretty impressive. And then a recent one is Dauntless on the Battle of Midway. And that's how the dive bombers finally got through to the aircraft carriers, because they'd expended all their combat air patrol and been brought down by the waves of attacks, showing that not those who failed in their objective didn't fail ultimately. They succeeded in depleting the defenses of the aircraft carriers. And now you've got missiles flying between Israel and Iran. And bear in mind, Iran is not just made up of Persians or Iranians. If you want to know does anyone know what the name Iran means and why they're no longer called the Persians? Apparently, Persian is a Western name that we gave to them, but they've always called themselves Iran. Does anyone know what Iran means? The land of the Aryans. So they are identifying themselves as Indo-European people. They are Iranians, they are the Aryans. But you can see there's a little bit of Arabs there in the south. You've got Turkmens and Kurds and a few others in different parts. And that also leads to different types of languages. And here's the linguistic composition of Iran. When we had the Persian Navy visiting here recently, we were trying to get Farsi Bibles to them. You can see the religious composition. There are quite a few Christians spread around. Zoroastrianism is the original religion of Persia. And there are a few Jews and there are quite a lot of Baha'is. There's a lot of Kurds in the north as well. And Kurdistan should be an independent country, but thanks to the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, when he was Secretary of the Colonies, he was put in charge of the Middle East after the First World War, and he redrew the maps of the Middle East after the First World War, ensuring that oil-rich places like Qatar and Bahrain and Kuwait were independent of Saudi Arabia, and that the Kurds didn't get their own independent state. And when the Kurds in Syria and northern Iraq started to rebel, he ordered Sopwith camels to drop mustard gas on them. So the Kurds remember the West being pretty treacherous on many accounts to them. The Kurdish people should form their own country, but they've been divided up between Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. You've heard of the Gulf of Persia and the Straits of Hormuz. So here's the straits, and it's actually a very narrow little strait. So the oil tankers are dropping anchor and waiting out at sea because all the insurance companies refuse to cover them for war damage if they go into the Persian Gulf. And the Straits of Hormuz is very narrow. You don't actually need battleships, just torpedo vessels can threaten them. Proverbs 20 verse 3 says, it is honorable for man to stop striving, since any fool can start a quarrel. But Matthew 5 verse 9 says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. And we praise God that President Trump has wanted to be a peacemaker, and he certainly has brought an end to quite a lot of wars in the last year. And his first term, he didn't start any war. He ended some. And I know a lot of his supporters are angry at the fact that he ran on a no wars, no more useless wars, no more forever wars. And many people feel that, you've gotten us involved in a war. But I don't think Donald Trump sees it like that. I think he sees it as stopping a war. And in a sense, he's cleaning up Jimmy Carter's mess. But still, this could cost him the midterm elections for the Congress, maybe even for the Senate. Depends how well the war goes. But peace has got to be brought somewhere along the line. Romans 12 verse 18 says, if it be possible, as much as lies in you, live peaceably with all men. That's hard. Now, we're called to be more than conquerors through Christ Jesus who loved us. David was a conqueror. He killed the giant Goliath. That was a great achievement. But our Lord Jesus was more than a conqueror. He took the enemy of the church, the persecuted church, Saul, and turned him into Paul, the apostle and missionary of the church. We've got a book in our library on son of Hamas. And this Mossab Hassan Yusuf, he is the son of one of the founders of Hamas, and he is converted to Christ. And I think this is one of the best things you can do. I've met people in Northern Ireland who were IRA terrorists who got converted to Christ and are now evangelists. To kill your enemy is one thing, but to convert your enemy, to be able to join you and fight against your mutual enemy, that is being more than a conqueror. So I believe in this time of insane anti-Christian violence, persecution of Christians like in Egypt, where the church is under fire, one of the best things we can do is work to win our enemies to Christ. Like our Christian friends in Egypt, they've been winning their Arab persecutors to Christ over the centuries. In Nigeria, Dr. Mark Gabriel is an Egyptian who was once training imams in the University of Cairo, which is like the Oxford of the Middle East. And today, Mark Gabriel lives in Canada. He's a Christian evangelist. He has won to Christ by the steadfast testimony of Coptic Christians in Egypt. And I think it's so important to try and win our enemies to Christ. He's written some great books like Jesus and Muhammad and Understanding the Mind of an Islamic Terrorist. Matthew 9 verse 39 says, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord the harvest, therefore, to thrust out workers into his harvest field. And that's something we've been trying to do. Over 20 years ago, I was in the Logos Hope mission ship off the coast of Port Elizabeth, Algoa Bay, and we're having an ultra-secret missions planning meeting on how to reach Muslims in the Middle East. And somebody came up with this idea of Sat-7, Satellite 7. George Weber was there. There was a whole lot of great missions mobilizers. And I actually, devil's advocate, I said, well, how many Muslims have access to satellite TV in the Middle East? And the man said, 50 million. I said, 50 million? Are you telling me the Bedouins have satellite dishes on their camels? He said, actually, as a matter of fact, they do. Well, any skepticism might have had is over. Sat-7 is based in Cyprus, which, by the way, has had a couple of Iranian missiles fired at Cyprus too. But Cyprus is normally an island of peace and stability in this ocean of instability in the Middle East. So Sat-7 broadcasts 24 hours a day into the Turkish language, 24 hours a day into the Farsi language for Persia, and 2 channels dedicated just to broadcasting in Arabic, 1 channel just for children. So they've got 4 channels working across the board throughout the Middle East, and every week they get thousands of emails, people wanting prayer, counsel, follow-up literature, online Bible studies, and so on. Sat-7 is a spectacular success. And if you want to get a bit of a feel for it, just Google, offhand one of my favorites, Easter Flash Mob, Beirut. And there's a church in Beirut. They were in a busy shopping center, and one person started to sing of the resurrection, and then another, and before you know it, there's a whole church choir in the shopping center singing impromptu, of course planned, gospel outreach ministry. And the Muslims all around are excitedly joining in and really impressed at this enthusiastic presentation of gospel. Sat7 broadcast the gospel. They broadcast the Jesus film in Arabic and Farsi. It's a great ministry. There's also Mecca, Middle East Christian Outreach, also based in Cyprus. And they are ministering to the Christians. Here you can see the percentage of Christians in the different Middle Eastern countries. And I must say the percentage in Iran is much higher now. They believe it's more like 1% of Iran are Christians at the moment. So what Mecca does is they aid the churches in the Middle East, the Coptics, the Syrians, the Chaldeans, and other Christians that are there. And so they organize them Bibles and Bible teaching. Frontiers Mission is the biggest mission to the Muslim world. I've been at the headquarters in Arizona. They've got missionaries scattered throughout the Middle East, including some people who've come to our Great Commission course that we've trained here and are ministering in the Middle East in some very difficult areas. Then you get Youth with a Mission, which one of our people is working, as I mentioned, in Jordan, Martha, and praise God for the Youth with a Mission people in the Middle East. And then you get Operation Mobilization. And their Logos Hope ship often docks into ports in the Middle East, and they make Bibles and Christian books available to people through the ship ministry. It's very strategic. I've been working at How to Reach Muslims for Christ for many years. We've broadcast the gospel in Arabic, showing the Jesus film in difficult areas, including in Nuba Mountains behind enemy lines, and seen Muslims come to Christ through gospel witness, and had the privilege of leading Muslims to Christ in countries like Nigeria and in the Middle East. There's a lot of testimonies in the Frontline Behind Enemy Lines for Christ book on winning Muslims to Christ and evangelizing terrorists. What we need is tracts for terrorists, Muslims for the Messiah, a redemption for revolutionaries, how to evangelize our enemies and turn terrorists into evangelists. Psalm 72 verse 9 says, the desert tribes will bow before him. His enemies will lick the dust. All kings will bow down to him. All nations will serve him. So visit our Frontline Mission SA.org website, where we will upload this presentation for you to share with friends, hopefully tomorrow already. And we've got good books and manuals that we've designed on understanding Islam and how to evangelize Muslims. We've run many Muslim evangelism seminars, including with our good friend Walter Eric and John Gilchrist here at Livingston House. And we've got the great resource of Life Challenge Africa. Walter Geschwantner, the founder of Life Challenge Africa, was one of our board members, and we've got a lot of his materials available on the Message of Nabi Isa.org. So the Message of Nabi Isa, that's the Gospel of Lord Jesus in Arabic, available for Muslims worldwide that we can share. There's a good tool, More Than Dreams, 5 testimonies, 5 true stories of Muslims who came to Christ, scattered throughout the Middle East in different stories, and gives you a good insight, but a great evangelistic tool that can be given to Muslims, an audiovisual way of presenting the gospel to them. Of course, our ministry in Sudan was a key way of seeing Muslims won to Christ, and I've documented in Faith Under Fire how even a whole company of National Islamic Front forces from the governor of Sudan came to the south, said, we want to become Christians, we want to fight for the south. And we've seen whole units won to Christ. When I spoke to the commander, I said, how did you persuade your entire company to defect? He said, well, of course, there were a few Muslim extremists, there were some of these jihadist fanatics, 8 of them, we had to kill them, but everyone else agreed. So sometimes you're even seeing enemy units, one, because they're repelled by the extremism of their leaders, and they're attracted by the tenacity and the courage of the Christians on the ground being persecuted. Slavery, Terrorism, and Islam, the Historic Roots and Contemporary Threats, one of our best-selling books. There's been so much in demand, and that includes our Muslim Evangelism Workshop Manual. We need to pray for the Muslim world. In this war, one of the most important things we can do is bombard the enemy with prayer and with Bibles and with gospel radio broadcasting, Sat7 audiovisual presentations. When you go to the Middle East, you should always have copies of the Passion of the Christ film, maybe on a flash drive, and the Jesus film in Arabic. There are so many good resources we can put in the hands of Muslims that can help them come to Christ. Just in Cape Town at Broekop, I've been able to give Bibles to people from Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. The Saudi Arabians say, this is illegal in my country. And they were so excited. Forbidden fruit, this is not allowed in our country. And they're so happy, can I keep this? Is this for me? And they're so thrilled to get a copy of the scripture. Just like some Muslims are excited to get hold of forbidden alcohol in Iran. You get them a Bible, well, that's even more valuable, even more explosive. So keep praying for the Muslim world. The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Pray for the Lord the harvest to thrust out laborers into his harvest.